I'm Veronica Marshall at the Capitol. This week on Senate Spotlight, a deep dive into special education after it receives special attention during the November budget forecast.
There's two areas where most of this increased spending, where the debt's coming from. That's in special education and that's in long-term care and disability waivers. And those are really hard decisions that are going to have to be made.
We talked to senators about the latest discussion around those decisions, the costs and benefits of special education in Minnesota, and what could happen next. That's coming up.
Senate Spotlight is produced by the Minnesota Senate and Senate Media Services.
State spending on special education is driving us closer to a more than $5 billion deficit. That's according to Minnesota's latest budget forecast released in November. Since then, the governor has shared his 2025 budget proposal, which includes a reduction in some special education reimbursement costs. But while state spending may go down, when it comes to special education in Minnesota, the numbers are going up. From the number of students needing special education services to the cost of those services themselves, school districts and the state budget are feeling the strain. So what can we do to support educators and some of their most vulnerable students with funding challenges ahead? I'm now joined by Senator Mary Kunesh, Chair of the Education Finance Committee, to talk it out. Senator, thank you for being here.
I'm happy to be here today.
Now, Senator, experts have testified that the number of students in Minnesota is going down, but the number of students needing special education services is actually going up. What does that mean for that budget?
Well, it means that that budget is going to be stressed, as most of the budgets are. And I think that with that rise in special ed students, there are a couple of different things that we can attribute that to. First of all, we are still coming out of the COVID period where the disconnection from school, from society, from the work that we do in the educational system are still affecting the students. So we are seeing some of those changes. The other thing is that we are now assessing children at an earlier age. You know, in kindergarten, they're tested and at different times in that first year of school, and so we're able to catch some of the things that we might not have caught at an earlier age, and that means that we're going to start addressing those earlier. And a lot of those efforts are starting at the very, very earliest age. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that we're catching up from COVID. And that makes me think of this question, you know, are there any general education changes that have been implemented recently, perhaps as a response, or, you know, other things that have come through the system, interventions, programming changes that might impact the number of special education students we're seeing that will take them out of that kind of status and lower our special education spending?
Well, one of the really great things that we were able to do is to put a lot of our dollars into the READ Act, which is the Science of Reading Act. And along with that act is, again, evaluating students a little more often and catching those students that are struggling the most. And we feel that if we really use interventions at that earlier age, that will counteract some of the issues and the problems, not just academic, but the social emotional issues that happen when students fall behind and they don't feel comfortable reading or talking about issues. Their academic skills seem to slip a little bit, so that early intervention is really important. The other thing that we did is we created funding for a special ed teacher pipeline that has been hugely successful. The University of Minnesota Mankato created a special program just to help those special ed, like paras or educational assistants who are in the field already doing a lot of this work, and it's helping them to get that licensure that they need. I believe that by the end of this year, we might have 30 new licensed special ed teachers in the system, which might not seem like a lot when you look at the need, but that's 30 that we didn't have, and we will hopefully continue to fund those dollars into that pipeline.
Now, Senator, you mentioned the special ed teacher pipeline, the READ Act. These are things that Minnesota has instituted, but we know special education is a federal mandate. So can you talk me through some of the other things that Minnesota is doing to go above and beyond those national standards and what it's costing us, if we know?
Sure. So we know that Minnesota thinks we're all, we are the best of all. And so there are different expectations that we have around our special ed accommodations, as well as the services that our students get. We require a smaller ratio to our teacher to student. Some of the outcomes and the expectations are higher. Along with that, of course, means paperwork. A little bit more paperwork, maybe a lot more paperwork, which is really something that we have tried to look at and would like to find ways to minimize some of that paperwork, either if it's the special ed teacher has relief from some of the things that need to be done or that are required, or we find ways to fund an additional support staff to do some of that paperwork. So those are some of the things that we've been looking at.
Well, I'm sure that is much appreciated. The November budget forecast was released back in November, and we're expecting a new forecast to come out this month. Has anything changed since November that could impact the budget in a positive way and kind of take special education out of that danger zone?
Well, first of all, special ed is a priority for us, and funding special ed is a priority for us. That wouldn't be the first place I would look to make cuts when it comes, if we have to make cuts. We're hopeful that when we get the next forecast, and I think we're going to see it more in March, that those dollars will have changed in a more positive way. Until we see those, we can't even begin to assume where the dollars can be spent or where we have to make some adjustments. And you ask about changes. I think probably the most concerning issue right now is the demise of the Department of Education at the federal level, and especially when it comes to special ed. We don't know, and that's the worst part of it all, is that we don't know what cuts would be coming from the federal government, if those dollar revenues are going to be shut off, if there are going to be strings attached to some of the funding. Those are the things that, we're trying to grapple with, and I think that will make the biggest impact on special education in Minnesota, and the whole financial spectrum of financing education in Minnesota is what's going to happen if the federal, if the Department of Education goes away and those dollars either disappear or are allocated in a way that we're not certain.
And we know historically, too, that the federal government hasn't always met its full obligation to pay for special education. So it certainly puts that in a more precarious place.
Very much so.
Can anything be done on our end to bring down the cost of special education without impacting the services we provide?
I don't know that we could. I really don't know that there is a way to adjust those spending unless we pull back dollars. And then we know that at the end of the day, it's going to be that student that has the biggest impact. So I would like to not decrease the funding for schools when it comes to special education and some of these other issues. But if there are ways to address it in curricular areas, if there are ways for schools to adjust their personnel as far as having, an additional person working with that student, and there might be other ways that schools can utilize their relationship with their community and the community resources to help with the needs of those special ed kids.
Yeah, and talk to me about the community. What have you been hearing from parents since the topic of special education and the state's deficit, far out, but it's been mentioned, together. What are you hearing from parents about that?
Well, parents are always going to advocate for their kids in the best way. I was a teacher for 25 years. I worked with my special ed classrooms to make sure that they had the resources they needed that I could provide for them. And the one thing I always came out of that is parents are really those students' champions. And so what we're hearing from parents is, please don't minimize the value of my student. Make sure that those services are still available. Oftentimes, special ed families and students create really unique relationships with their teachers and with their aides. And the last thing we want to do is to disrupt those relationships and the security of those students coming in. And so I guess, when I talk to parents about it, I will always say we're going to do the best to at least maintain the level that we have right now in Minnesota. And if there are ways, like this pipeline, if there's a way that we can actually enhance it, we will. But we have to be very careful so that one program isn't at the risk of another program in our school districts. Yeah.
In a worst case scenario, if the state did have to dial back some of its funding, who or what might pick up some of that slack? Like, what kind of organizations are out there, private or nonprofit, that parents could turn to?
Sure. There are different organizations, nonprofit organizations that really advocate for the special ed students and students with disability. And so I have a feeling that some of them would really kick it up and do what they could to help. If there are federal dollars out there, there are a lot of organizations that come to me and say, we have these, there's a federal grant, would you match our federal grant? Those are the sort of things that I would hope. We have a lot of faith-based organizations that are there to help the schools. And it might be that, again, with the uncertainty of what's happening at the federal level, we might see more and more participation from community after-school programs, the county, the cities. There might be opportunities in that area.
Okay. Senator, during a recent Education Finance Committee meeting, Republicans called for reforms in funding, talking about barriers and silos for schools to get the funding that they need where they want it. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's easy to ask for reforms. And when I look at where the dollars go for education in Minnesota, and we talk about silos or budget lines or areas, some of those areas, by federal law, we can't commingle. We can't move from one to the next to the next to the next. But there are ways that we have been looking at the finances of education, thinking about if we really did have to trim this down. And I really hope that that doesn't happen. I hope that the taxpayers come through for us at the end of the day. Where would we have to trim some of those areas? I'm not sure where they are exactly. Anywhere that we do it, there's going to be some group of parents or advocacy saying, no, not us, don't do that. But it could be across the board that there would have to be a reduction in some area, but we certainly don't want it to be at the expense of the students and at the expense of our teachers. That's really what we're here to ensure, that they have the kind of community, the kind of environment, and the funds that they need to do their job.
Senator, anything else you'd like to say on the issue?
Just that, we are very tuned into the needs and the unique situation of our special ed and our kids with disability. As I said, I was a teacher for 25 years and worked with a lot of students in a lot of different ways. And so understanding just how important it is that we really focus on the needs of these students not at the expense of their education or their safety or their well-being, is really foremost on my mind. And I know the rest of my members in our caucus are also feeling this pressure to make sure that we do the best that we can for our students when it comes to finance, when it comes to making sure they have everything they need to be successful in this world.
Senator, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
There's a new bill that hopes to address Minnesota's shortage of special education teachers. Senator Ann Johnson Stewart's bill, Senate File 249, expands the eligibility for the state's income tax credit for master's degrees to include special education curriculums. She says the credit could help offset the high costs of master's programs, which can be required for some special education teachers. Nearly 145,000 K-12 students received special education services in Minnesota last year. That's just over 17% of all Minnesotan students. Despite the growing need for these services, the state might have to cut back on its funding. To take me through this complex issue, I'm now joined by the ranking minority member of the Education Finance Committee, Republican Senator Jason Rarick. Senator, welcome to Senate Spotlight.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So when the November budget forecast was released, special education was kind of targeted as being one of the big spenders that's bringing us closer to a budget deficit. And so now some people are concerned that some of its programs might be targeted to help balance that budget. What are your thoughts on that? What are you hearing?
It's something that there are some talks about it, but I do not believe there are a lot of that's going to happen. I think we all recognize the importance of these programs. We've been hearing, over the years from our schools about the special education cross subsidy. We took on more of that responsibility from the state in the last 2 years, and I really don't see us backing away from that. I think the bigger conversation will be what can we do to help make it more affordable and not have to cut back in those areas.
Thank you for that. We also know that a majority of the E-12 Education General Fund budget goes towards general education, not special education. Are there any talks about general education programming possibly being targeted if special education is being targeted?
I have not heard any of that discussion. Again, I think what I relate this to in both the general education and the special education is looking to give school districts more flexibility with how they manage programs and then their spending in those areas. That flexibility, I believe, would make it more affordable for every school district around the state to be able to do the things that they believe are best for their students.
When we talk about special education, it's a wide range of things that are taking those dollars. Do we know what are the biggest drivers of state spending in special education?
I think some of the prescriptions that we've put on our schools here at the state level, I've just asked MDE to kind of talk to us about what does the state require above and beyond, and I got a report, 39 pages of requirements from the state above and beyond what the federal requirements are. And I think sometimes we get so prescriptive, we're taking away that local flexibility, local control to be able to do what they can manage best. And so I think we need to take a look at that. What have we put in place? Are there ways we can step back a little bit, maybe make these kind of goals for our schools to attain, but giving them that flexibility to get there rather than being so prescriptive that some of our smallest schools really struggle and it becomes way more costly to incorporate it that way. I think that's probably one of the biggest steps that we could take in trying to address this issue.
Now, Senator, when we talk about more local control and more flexibility, where do charter schools fit in that conversation?
They're public schools, so they fall under these same requirements. They do get some of the same reimbursements. But again, I think it's that same thing. A number of the charter schools have higher populations of students of need, and then others have smaller populations. So again, I think it's that flexibility across the board that would really improve what these schools can provide and give that best programming for the students that need the services.
Now, we know that in education spending, there's the general fund and then there's the special education fund. And you mentioned the cross subsidy where you don't have enough money in your special education fund, so you pull from the general fund. And in a recent meeting, Senator Lucero said, there are some barriers in the current system that really keeps that money siloed, and it prevents school districts from putting it towards their programming where it's needed. Can you talk to me a little bit about some of those barriers that are there?
Yeah, that's something that we are so guilty of at the legislature. Somebody comes forward with an idea, and in and of itself, it can be a very good idea. We pass it through, make it a requirement on all school districts, and we tie funding maybe to that, or some reporting issues, and funding is tied specifically to that. Some schools can't make it happen and they lose the funding. Some schools maybe were already doing it and the funding thus gets lost because of the fact they were already doing that, and the funding was for new positions or something. So I think that's what we need to be willing to take a step back as a legislature to say, again, what are some of these ideas? Is it something that should be spelled out so specifically as we put it onto the school districts at the local levels that they suddenly have no flexibility, no ability to move money from one account to another where their highest needs are? I think that's something we absolutely have to step back from and look at these next 2 years. It's imperative for our schools. We've heard from them over and over how they're struggling to make the new mandates work, how they're all going into the red with what's happened. If we don't do something, they could be hurting.
Yeah, I've heard before that one size fits all doesn't always work, across all subjects and policies. And it sounds like a lot what you're saying. When it comes to special education programming, we're putting a lot in financially. What are we getting back? What results are we seeing from that investment, and what are we considering success in that arena?
Yeah, I think the results are mixed. A lot of it depends on the area you are in. I think some of our larger schools in the metro area, they have better access to maybe contract out for services. Those tend to be a little more expensive. But I think the results that we see from them really help those students thrive. Some of our smaller, more rural school districts, they really struggle to be able to provide those same services and be able to have the same outcomes. So that's where I think if we could look at helping build some cooperatives where a number of schools pool together to provide those services and to help them. It might be a little more costly again for transportation, things of that nature, but I think in the end, if it shows that students are getting the services that really help them excel and maybe move out of the special education realm, that would be a step that we should absolutely consider. It would be far more cost effective, I think, to be able to see these things, deal with it, and move kids beyond those programs.
Yeah. You mentioned that transportation costs are something that is a factor, and we know that those costs have been going up. Is there any conversation around transportation specifically for those costs?
There has been some. I know we just heard a bill in the Senate Finance Committee, Education Finance Committee, around using those dollars that were specifically meant for hiring new positions last year and opening that up for transportation needs as well for some of our rural districts. So the conversation has started, but it is something that is definitely going to require more. There are people who are opposed to that. They want to see it remain for hiring new folks, but again, we see the differences across districts. The money isn't enough for some rural school districts to hire a full-time position. They can't hire part-time. There's no demand for that. There aren't people to fill a part-time position. So again, it's that flexibility piece that if we aren't willing to consider that, we're probably not helping schools the way we think we are.
Senator, when the November budget forecast came out, and special education was noted for being a big spender. Another thing that was mentioned by your caucus was the amount of fraud, waste, and abuse here in Minnesota. Do you think if we were finding ways to counter that, that could impact the budget in a positive way and kind of lift special education out of this danger zone?
Absolutely. You know, I think the numbers vary widely as to what we believe is out there in fraud. I think, you know, we're currently sitting at a number of about 500 million that's kind of thought to be out there. We're hearing some folks within the DHS realm that say the number could actually be in the range of $3 billion. If, you know, when we're looking at a $5.1 billion deficit looming, if we really have $3 billion that's going out in fraud, that takes that number down quite drastically, you know, over half. So I think that would definitely help a lot of these programs that are maybe worried that they have a target on them. If we can rein that in, I think it helps across the board.
Many other education funding formulas are pupil-based, and special education in Minnesota uses reimbursements for calculating aids and rates. What does that mean, and does that make the process more susceptible to fraud?
So yeah, what it means is that we're reimbursing schools for their actual costs. When you look at the per pupil funding, a lot of times different schools have different costs per student, depending on, you know, again, transportation, what are other needs. So this is definitely a better way of reimbursing schools. I'm not quite as worried about the fraud in this area as some of the others. I do trust our local school boards. When I did talk about some of the programs that are contracted out, I think that opens the door possibly a little bit, but you know, our school districts are watching that. They're watching their dollars very closely. You know, where we're seeing the fraud happen in these other areas tends to be reimbursements to nonprofits or other organizations that are kind of coming in and popping up overnight. Our school districts have all been around for a long, long time with local elected officials. I think for the most part they can be trusted, and I'm not too worried about fraud at any major level in these programs.
In the event that the budget does need to be trimmed and special education is on the line, some people have floated the idea of raising taxes or taxing new items like cannabis. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't believe we need to be doing any new taxes. You know, I think I would suggest we have more of a spending problem in the state than we do generating revenue through taxes. Again, if we can get our hands around some of the fraud that's out there, really take a look at, you know, is government needing everything it's getting? When I look at the 40% increase to government agencies in the last biennium, I think we can find our ways to streamline that rather than to be raising new taxes on Minnesotans.
Senator, any final thoughts on this topic?
You know, I think it all boils down to the fact that we need to be listening more to our superintendents, to our principals, to our teachers, and to families. The more we open our ears and listen to what they say their needs are, and then the problems they're having incorporating the things that we are asking them to do, we have to hear that, and we have to take a step back from what we've done, say what can we do differently to help them out. In the end, when you look at the reading and the writing and the math scores, they're all going down. I believe our local teachers and our local school boards have our students' best interests in mind, and we need to give them the flexibility to be able to address their local needs. I think that's how we turn it around.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you again for having me.